March 19, 1945. Kanoya Air Base, Kyushu, Japan. The cherry blossoms are blooming early this year. Petals drift across the airfield like snow, catching in the propeller blades of the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters lined along the taxiway. Lieutenant Takashi Yamamoto stands beside his aircraft, a folded piece of rice paper pressed between his palms. He is 23 years old. His flight suit smells of gasoline and incense. In his breast pocket, tucked against his heart, is a letter he will never mail, a letter that will be found 72 hours from now in the wreckage of his plane, 5 miles off the coast of Okinawa, and will remain classified by both Japanese and American authorities for 38 years. The letter is 8 sentences long. The last sentence reads, "We were told that spirit could overcome matter, that our will could bend steel. But their steel bends nothing. It simply multiplies." Around him, 250 other pilots prepare for the same mission. They tie hachimaki headbands around their foreheads, each inscribed with rising sun, symbols, and prayers. They drink ceremonial sake from wooden cups. Some write final poems. Others simply stare at the horizon, where American ships wait like a steel reef, guns bristling, radar turning, ready to transform young men into fire and smoke and debris scattered across an indifferent ocean. These are the Takotai, the special attack units, though history will remember them by the name the Americans gave them, Kamikaze, Divine Wind. They are Japan's answer to American industrial power. They are honor weaponized, tradition made explosive, and they are, though few will admit it aloud, an admission of defeat. This is not a story about courage, though courage existed in terrible abundance on both sides. This is not about the morality of desperation tactics, though that question haunts the historical record. This is about the moment when ideology collided with engineering, when centuries of cultural belief shattered against the simple, brutal arithmetic of industrial production. This is about what Takashi Yamamoto understood in his final hours, what he tried to communicate in 8 sentences on rice paper, and why that understanding came too late to save his life or his nation. The war had not always been hopeless. In December 1941, Japan's naval aviation was arguably the finest in the world. The Zero fighter was faster, more maneuverable, and longer range than anything the Americans could field. Japanese pilots were superbly trained, many with combat experience from China. They struck Pearl Harbor with precision and audacity, sinking battleships, destroying aircraft, demonstrating tactical excellence that shocked the American military establishment. For 6 months, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with a speed that seemed to validate every assumption about Yamato Damashii, the Japanese spirit, as a force multiplier that could overcome material disadvantage. The calculations had been straightforward. Japan was resource poor, industrially inferior to the United States in every measurable category. But wars, Japanese military theorists argued, were not won by production statistics. They were won by morale, by training, by the willingness to sacrifice. One Japanese pilot, properly motivated, properly trained, was worth 5 Americans. One Japanese soldier was worth 10. Quality would defeat quantity. Spirit would defeat steel. The war would be short, brutal, and victorious because the Americans, soft, individualistic, materialistic, would lack the stomach for prolonged sacrifice. They would negotiate. They would compromise. They would accept a new order in Asia rather than pay the blood price necessary to defeat it. But by 1945, those calculations had been revealed as catastrophically wrong. The American industrial machine had not compromised. It had accelerated. In 1941, the United States produced 2,141 combat aircraft. In 1944, it produced 74,000. The numbers were so absurd they seemed like propaganda. Japanese intelligence officers, reviewing captured documents, assumed the figures were inflated for morale purposes. But the figures were real. More than real, they were conservative. American shipyards launched aircraft carriers faster than Japan could train pilots. American factories built fighters in the time it took Japanese craftsmen to hand-fit a single Zero's engine cowling. The mathematics had inverted. It was no longer one Japanese pilot against 5 Americans. It was one Japanese pilot against 50 American planes, backed by radar, by proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, by coordinated fighter direction, by an infrastructure so vast it could absorb losses that would cripple any other nation and simply build more. Takashi Yamamoto had watched this transformation from the cockpit. He had flown his first combat mission in October 1943, escorting bombers during the raid on Rabaul. His squadron launched with 18 Zeros. 12 returned. By January 1944, his squadron had been rotated to the Philippines. They launched with 14 Zeros. 5 returned. By June, they were defending the Marianas. They launched with 9 Zeros. 2 returned. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots called it nothing because most of them were dead, shot down by Hellcat fighters that were faster, tougher, and flown by pilots who had trained for 18 months in peaceful skies over Texas and California, while Japanese pilots got perhaps 6 months of instruction with dwindling fuel supplies before being thrown into combat. He had expected glory. They all had. The recruitment posters showed heroic pilots in gleaming aircraft, rising sun emblems bright, enemy planes falling in flames. The training officers spoke of samurai tradition, of Bushido, of the warrior's path. To die in service to the emperor was the highest honor. To return alive while comrades perished was shame. These were not empty slogans. Yamamoto believed them. He came from a family of minor nobility in Hiroshima, steeped in martial tradition. His grandfather had fought in the Russo-Japanese War. His father had served in Manchuria. Service was identity. Honor was survival. The individual meant nothing, the collective everything. These were truths deeper than thought, embedded in language and ritual and social structure. But truths Yamamoto discovered could die, not all at once, not dramatically, but through accumulation, the slow erosion of belief under the weight of contrary evidence. His logbook, preserved in Japanese naval archives, tells the story in terse entries. October 1943, engaged enemy fighters. Shot down 1 Wildcat. Squadron performed well. January 1944. Engaged multiple enemy fighters. New type very fast. Lost Kuwahara and Sato. April 1944. Overwhelmed by numbers. Radio communications jammed. Could not regroup. June 1944. Destroyed on ground before takeoff. Airfield bombed. New aircraft unavailable. By September 1944, the entries become sparse, fatalistic. No change. More losses. Replacement pilots inexperienced. Fuel short. The kamikaze program began officially in October 1944, though the philosophy had been gestating for months. If Japanese pilots could no longer compete in aerial combat, if training took too long, if fuel was too scarce, if replacement aircraft never arrived, then perhaps the aircraft itself could become the weapon. A Zero loaded with explosives, flown directly into an American ship by a pilot committed to certain death, became a guided missile. It required minimal training. It bypassed the need for long-range torpedoes or armor-piercing bombs. It converted Japan's mounting desperation into a tactical system, and it drew upon the deepest wells of Japanese culture. The idea that a beautiful death in service to a greater cause was the pinnacle of human achievement. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze strategy, made the appeal explicit in his October 19, 1944 speech to assembled pilots. Japan faces a terrible crisis. The salvation of our country is now beyond the power of ministers, the general staff, or this admiral. It is now up to spirited young men such as you. I ask you to give your lives, to crash dive your fighters into enemy carriers. You are already gods, without earthly desires. Your deaths will serve as the foundation of the empire for the next 1,000 years. Yamamoto heard a recording of that speech during his transfer to Kanoya Air Base in February 1945. He listened to Onishi's voice crackling through a phonograph speaker in a briefing room that smelled of mildew and aviation fuel. Around him, other pilots sat rigidly, faces composed. Some wept quietly. Some showed no expression at all. Yamamoto felt a strange numbness. He understood the logic. He even accepted it. What he could not reconcile was the gap between the philosophy and the reality. If their deaths were to be the foundation of the empire, why were they being asked to die? Because every other option had failed. If they were gods, why were they losing? The symbolic object that haunted him, the detail that would not leave his thoughts, was the rivet. American aircraft were full of them. Rivets by the thousands, machine-driven, uniform, strong, holding together aluminum sheets stamped out by the acre in factories that operated 24 hours a day. Japanese aircraft also used rivets, but many components were still hand-assembled by skilled craftsmen who fitted each piece with precision, ensuring perfect aerodynamic smoothness. This took time, skill, pride. A Zero's fuselage represented hundreds of hours of meticulous labor. An American Hellcat represented assembly line efficiency. And the Americans built 15 Hellcats in the time it took to build one Zero. Yamamoto had seen captured American aircraft. He had walked around a downed Corsair that had been recovered nearly intact after its pilot bailed out over Leyte Gulf. The Corsair was brutish, inelegant. Its rivets protruded slightly. Its paint was thick and careless. The cockpit was utilitarian, designed for function rather than aesthetic harmony. It should have been inferior, but it was not. It was faster than a Zero, more heavily armed, better armored, and there were thousands of them, an endless stream pouring off production lines in Connecticut and California, flown by pilots who had trained in safety, who had fuel to spare, who would be replaced if shot down by another pilot in another plane, a cycle as relentless as the tides. He tried to explain this in a letter to his younger brother, Kinji, in January 1945. The letter was intercepted by military censors and never delivered, but survives in the archives. Brother, they tell us that our spirit is superior, that our willingness to die will overcome their machines. And I believe in our spirit. I have seen men do extraordinary things through will alone. But I have also seen 10 of our finest pilots shot down by 50 American planes, and then 50 more American planes arrive the next day, and 50 more the day after that. How do we fight production itself? How do we fight a nation that can lose 100 planes and simply build 200 more? I do not doubt our courage. I doubt the mathematics. That doubt was heresy, and Yamamoto knew it. But doubt, once admitted, grows. By March 1945, stationed at Kanoya and assigned to the Kamikaze Corps, he began to observe his surroundings with a clarity that felt almost hallucinatory. The air base was deteriorating. Bomb craters pocked the runways, repaired with shovels and gravel, because construction equipment had been destroyed or lacked fuel. The Zeros were aging, cannibalized for parts. Maintenance crews worked with improvised tools. Fuel was cut with turpentine to stretch supplies. Meals had dwindled to rice and pickled vegetables. Everything was scarce except for two things: patriotic exhortations and young men willing to die. The contrast between ideology and reality became unbearable. Officers spoke constantly of Yamato Damashii, of glorious sacrifice, of imminent victory through spiritual strength. But the evidence of material collapse was everywhere. Aircraft held together with wire. Pilots eating watery soup. Sick men flying because there were no replacements. And overhead, daily, American bombers flying in formations so large they darkened the sky, untouchable, dropping tons of ordnance with industrial indifference. The bombers did not dogfight. They did not seek glory. They simply flew in their precise formations, dropped their loads, and returned to carriers that could launch 100 aircraft, recover them, rearm them, and launch them again the next day. On March 17th, Yamamoto was formally briefed on his mission. He would be part of Operation Kikusui, Floating Chrysanthemum, a mass kamikaze attack involving over 300 aircraft targeting the American fleet off Okinawa. His specific assignment: dive into an aircraft carrier. He was given a map, a compass heading, and a silk scarf. The briefing officer told him he would become a god. His name would be enshrined at Yasukuni. His family would receive honors. He nodded, bowed, accepted the scarf. That night, he could not sleep. He lay on his bunk in the barracks, listening to other pilots breathe and snore and cry quietly in the darkness, and he thought about rivets. He thought about factories in Detroit and Los Angeles, about assembly lines he had seen in propaganda films intended to mock American materialism. The films showed workers in identical uniforms, repeating mechanical motions, building machines without craftsmanship or soul. The films were meant to demonstrate American spiritual poverty. But Yamamoto saw something else: efficiency, coordination, scale. The Americans had built a system where individual skill mattered less than collective output, where a riveter did not need to be an artist, only competent because the design was standardized and the quality control was systematic. It was soulless, perhaps, but worked. Japanese philosophy had always elevated the particular over the general, the unique over the standardized. A sword was folded 1,000 times by a master smith. A tea ceremony was performed with attention to every detail. Beauty resided in imperfection. Wabi-sabi, the acceptance that nothing lasts, nothing is finished, nothing is perfect. This aesthetic permeated military culture. A pilot was not merely trained, he was cultivated. His aircraft was not merely functional. It was an extension of his spirit. This was beautiful. It was also slow, expensive, and impossible to scale. The Americans had no such refinement. They built machines designed for mass production. They trained pilots quickly, in vast numbers, using standardized curricula. They accepted that many pilots would be mediocre, because mediocre pilots in superior numbers flying durable aircraft with coordinated support would defeat elite pilots in fragile aircraft flying alone. The arithmetic was brutal but conclusive, and Yamamoto, lying awake on March 17, 1945, understood with devastating clarity that honor could not solve an arithmetic problem. On the morning of March 18th, he began writing the letter. He had to be careful. Military police monitored outgoing mail. Defeatism was punishable by arrest, dishonor, sometimes execution. But he felt compelled to record his thoughts, even if they never reached anyone. The act of writing was itself a small rebellion, an assertion of individual thought in a system that demanded total sublimation of self to collective will. The letter was addressed to no one. It began, "To whoever finds this." He wrote in careful, formal Japanese, using characters that required precision. "I fly tomorrow against the American fleet. I am told this is honorable, necessary, the fulfillment of my duty as a warrior. And I believe it is. I do not fear death. I fear that my death will be meaningless. I fear that we have mistaken the nature of this war. We were told that spirit could overcome matter, that our will could bend steel. But their steel bends nothing. It simply multiplies." He continued, describing what he had witnessed: the attrition, the impossible numbers, the industrial capacity that seemed almost supernatural in its scope. He wrote about the Corsair he had examined, its crude rivets and brutal efficiency. He wrote about American pilots, not with contempt, but with grudging recognition. They were not warriors in the Japanese sense, but they were effective, and effectiveness, he realized, was its own form of mastery. He wrote about the hunger, the lack of fuel, the deteriorating aircraft, and the cheerful lies told by officers who knew the truth but could not speak it. The final paragraph was the most dangerous. "I will die tomorrow because I must, because honor demands it, because to refuse would dishonor my family and betray my comrades. But I die knowing that my death will change nothing. One more plane crashing into one more ship will not alter the outcome of this war. The Americans will repair the damage, or build a new ship, and the war will continue until we have no more planes and no more pilots. We are not fighting an enemy. We are fighting arithmetic, and arithmetic cannot be defeated by courage." He folded the letter into a small square and placed it in his flight suit pocket next to his heart. He did not know if it would survive the crash. He suspected it would not. Most kamikaze pilots left no physical remains. They were vaporized on impact, or burned, or drowned, body and machine melting together into anonymous wreckage. But the act of writing, of articulating his thoughts, brought a strange peace. He had spoken a truth that could not be spoken aloud. That was enough. On March 19th, at 0615 hours, Yamamoto climbed into a Zero. The aircraft was old, its paint faded, its engine oil-stained. A 250-kilogram bomb was strapped beneath the fuselage. The extra weight made the plane sluggish, less maneuverable. It did not matter. He would not need to maneuver. He would need only to aim and commit. The engine coughed, caught, settled into a rough idle. Around him, hundreds of other engines roared to life. The noise was overwhelming, a mechanical thunder that drowned out thought. The takeoff was staggered. Yamamoto's squadron launched forth, climbing into a pale, dawn sky. The formation was loose, undisciplined by earlier standards, but earlier standards no longer applied. They were not fighters. They were missiles. Below, the Japanese coastline receded. Green hills, terraced rice paddies, villages where families slept or prepared breakfast, unaware that overhead, 250 young men were flying towards certain death. The flight south took 3 hours. Yamamoto flew in silence, radio chatter minimal. The squadron leader occasionally called course corrections. Otherwise, there was only the roar of the engine and the wind and the knowledge that every minute brought him closer to finality. He thought about his brother, his parents, the cherry blossoms at Kanoya Air Base. The letter pressed against his chest. At 0945 hours, they spotted the American fleet. It was vast. Hundreds of ships spread across the ocean. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, auxiliaries. An armada, so large it seemed impossible that the world contained enough steel to build it. And above the fleet, like a protective swarm, American fighters circled. Hellcats, Corsairs, dozens of them, already climbing to intercept. Yamamoto felt a strange calm. The fear he had expected did not come. Instead, a kind of resignation settled over him. This was the end, and he had known it would be the end, and there was nothing more to decide. The squadron leader's voice crackled over the radio. Tenno Haika Banzai. Long live the Emperor. 250 pilots echoed the cry. Then the formation broke apart as each pilot selected his target. Yamamoto chose a carrier, massive and gray, its deck crowded with aircraft. Anti-aircraft fire began immediately. Black puffs of flak, tracer rounds arcing upward, proximity-fused shells exploding in precise airbursts. The Americans had calculated the optimal dispersal pattern for shrapnel. They had engineered their defenses with the same industrial efficiency they applied to everything else. Planes began to fall. Zeros exploded in midair or spun, downward trailing smoke. American fighters dove into the formation, guns blazing. Yamamoto saw a Zero disintegrate as a Hellcat's .50 caliber rounds tore through it. He pushed his stick forward, entering a steep dive. The carrier grew larger. He could see sailors on deck, running, pointing, manning guns. The anti-aircraft fire intensified. Something struck his wing, a sharp crack, metal tearing. The Zero shuddered but held together. Altimeter unwinding. 3,000 meters, 2,500, 2,000. The historical record shows that of the 355 Japanese aircraft launched during Operation Kikusui No. 1 on March 19, 1945, approximately 320 were destroyed. American losses: 2 destroyers sunk, 12 ships damaged, minimal aircraft losses. The mathematics were exactly as Yamamoto had described. Hopeless. But mathematics, in those final seconds, ceased to matter. There was only the dive, the target, the commitment. At 1,500 meters, a Hellcat locked onto Yamamoto's tail. He felt the impacts, bullets punching through the fuselage, control cables severing. The Zero rolled violently. He fought to stabilize, but the aircraft was dying. Below, the carrier fired every gun it had. The sky was solid with steel and fire. At 800 meters, his engine seized. The propeller froze. The Zero became a glider, still diving but decelerating. At 400 meters, he knew he would not reach the carrier. The plane was too damaged, the angle too shallow. He was going to crash into the ocean beside the ship, close enough to see, too far to harm. There's a photograph, taken from the carrier USS Hancock, that shows a zero in its final moments. The plane is inverted, one wing sheared off, smoke pouring from the engine. It is impossible to identify the pilot. It could be Yamamoto. It could be any of the 100 other pilots who died that day. The photograph is grainy, black and white, clinical. Just another kill. Another piece of debris about to hit the water. Yamamoto's Zero struck the ocean at approximately 1,007 hours, 5 miles southeast of the American fleet. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated. The pilot's body was never recovered. But the letter, sealed in a waterproof pouch by chance or instinct, survived. It was found by an American destroyer crew 3 days later, floating among the wreckage. The crew, not understanding Japanese, turned it over to Naval Intelligence. Naval Intelligence translated it, classified it, and filed it away. It remained classified until 1983, when a graduate student researching kamikaze operations requested declassification under the Freedom of Information Act. The letter's contents were shocking not because they revealed military secrets, but because they revealed psychological truth. Here was a kamikaze pilot, a figure mythologized and demonized in equal measure, expressing doubt, articulating strategic clarity, recognizing the futility of his own sacrifice. American intelligence officers who read the letter in 1945 recommended its suppression. Public knowledge that kamikaze pilots understood the hopelessness of their mission might complicate post-war narratives about Japanese fanaticism. Better to maintain the image of mindless zealots than to admit that young men flew to their deaths with full knowledge of futility, trapped by honor and social obligation in a system that offered no exit. Japanese authorities also suppressed the letter when it eventually came to light. It contradicted the official narrative of glorious sacrifice. Yamamoto was not supposed to doubt. He was supposed to die joyfully, transcendently, his spirit merging with the divine wind. The letter suggested something Messier, a young man trapped between belief and evidence, between cultural obligation and individual perception, choosing death not because he embraced it, but because refusing was unthinkable. The transformation the letter represents is the transformation that came too late to save Japan. The recognition that ideology cannot substitute for industrial capacity, that cultural superiority is meaningless against material abundance, that honor is a luxury afforded only to those who can afford to lose. By March 1945, Japan had nothing left but honor, and honor could not feed the population, could not fuel the aircraft, could not replace the ships sunk by American submarines and aircraft. Honor could only send young men to die in gestures that were tactically meaningless and strategically catastrophic. The Americans did not win the Pacific War because they were braver or more skilled or culturally superior. They won because they built more ships, more planes, more tanks, more trucks, more of everything at a speed and scale that seemed impossible until it became inevitable. They won because their system, messy, democratic, capitalistic, proved more adaptable, more innovative, more productive than Japan's rigid hierarchy. They won because a riveter in a factory in Detroit, earning union wages and going home to a suburban house, was as important to victory as a Marine on Iwo Jima. This was the truth that Japanese militarism could not accommodate. That wars are won not by the warrior elite, but by industrial systems that can sustain losses and continue fighting. Takashi Yamamoto understood this. He wrote it down. He carried it into the sky. And then he died, one of approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots who perished during the war, achieving tactical results that range from negligible to moderate while suffering total losses. The divine wind did not save Japan. It consumed a generation of young men in a strategy born from desperation and sustained by a philosophy that confused death with meaning. In the decades after the war, Japan rebuilt. The same cultural values that produced meticulous craftsmanship and intense loyalty were redirected toward industrial production and economic competition. Japanese factories became world-renowned for quality and efficiency. The rivet, that symbol of American mass production, was perfected by Japanese engineers who combined standardization with precision, creating manufacturing processes that balance scale with craftsmanship. The nation that lost the war won the peace, demonstrating that cultural values are not fixed but adaptable, that the same spirit that drove kamikaze pilots could drive economic innovation. But the cost of that lesson was enormous. Cities burned, millions died, an entire generation was sacrificed to the gap between ideology and reality, between what leaders believed and what evidence showed. Yamamoto's letter stands as testimony to that gap. 8 sentences that articulate what official pronouncements could not admit. That they were losing, had always been losing, would continue to lose, not because of moral failing, but because the mathematics were insurmountable. There is a memorial at Kanoya Air Base today. It lists the names of kamikaze pilots who flew from that field, including Yamamoto's. Visitors leave flowers. Students take photographs. Tour guides explain the historical context. The cherry blossoms still bloom in March, drifting across the airfield where Zeros no longer take off. It is peaceful, respectful, and it is wrapped in the same ambiguity that surrounded the kamikaze program itself. Were these young men heroes or victims? Is their sacrifice ennobling or horrifying? Can both be true? Yamamoto's letter suggests an answer. They were human. They were caught in a system that demanded their deaths and provided no honorable alternative. They understood, or came to understand, the futility. And they flew anyway, not because they were fanatics, but because the weight of history and culture and obligation was too heavy to refuse. That is not heroism in the traditional sense, but it is not fanaticism either. It is tragedy, the recognition of doom and the inability to choose otherwise. The rivets still fascinate. American industrial production during World War II remains one of history's great economic achievements. 18,500 combat aircraft produced in a single year. A Liberty ship launched every day. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, ammunition, food, medicine, all in quantities that staggers comprehension. The system that produced those rivets also produced the wealth, the infrastructure, the educational institutions, the political freedoms that made such production possible. It was not perfect. It was riven with inequality, racism, exploitation. But it worked. It could absorb losses that would destroy other nations and simply build more. That is what Yamamoto saw in the crude construction of a captured Corsair. Not inferiority, but a different philosophy of warfare. The Americans had built a machine designed to be built quickly, repaired easily, flown by adequately trained pilots, and replaced without hesitation. It was warfare as logistics, as engineering, as arithmetic. And arithmetic, in the end, defeated honor. On a warm March morning in 1945, a young man folded a letter and placed it against his heart. He climbed into an aging fighter, took off into a pale sky, and flew south to die. His death changed nothing. The war continued. The ships sailed. The factories built more planes. But his letter survived, a small piece of paper floating in an enormous ocean, carrying 8 sentences that told a truth his nation could not yet speak. That they had mistaken the nature of the contest, that spirit alone was not enough, that the enemy's strength lay not in ideology, but in capacity, the simple, grinding capacity to produce, sustain, and outlast. The cherry blossoms fall. The rivets rust. The letter rests in an archive, available to researchers by appointment. And the lesson endures, stark and inarguable. In industrial war, engineering defeats honor not because honor is worthless, but because engineering is relentless. One is a philosophy, the other is a system. And systems, fed by resources and reinforced by production, do not tire, do not doubt, do not negotiate. They simply continue until there is nothing left to fight, until the arithmetic reaches its inevitable conclusion, until the sky is empty and the ocean closes over the wreckage, and the young men who understood too late are silent forever.